he told me, is older than he looks. And he has 6 children. Now, he didn't say that as a way of demonstrating his age, but in any case, it's for some of us, we consider that an absolutely marvelous circumstance. He's just publishing a book, The Jewish State, The Struggle for Israel's Soul. For anyone, a fascinating topic. He was educated at Princeton University, receiving a Bachelor of Arts degree in Japanese Studies. I should note, for those of you who are argumentative, but no one here really is, that he took first place in the North American Debate Championships in 1985. And the Princeton team, when he was on it, was ranked first in the American parliamentary debate sessions. His PhD is from Rutgers in political philosophy. He's worked for the Jerusalem Post on its editorial staff. He was a member of the Israeli delegation to the Madrid Conference, 1991. He has served as an advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu during the years 91 to 94 when Netanyahu was head of the opposition in the Knesset. And he was also the research director for Netanyahu's 2 original books. And in 1994, with the founding of the Shalem Center, he became its first, and in a way, founding president. And that institution, in a way, I think defines or introduces Dr. Hazony well. It's an institute devoted to the study of Jewish social thought and Israel's public policy. The institute publishes a journal, Azure, subtitled Ideas for the Jewish State. And it also publishes in Hebrew great classics of Western thought. The Federalist Papers either has been published this year, or is going to be published this year. It's also published Hayek's Road to Serfdom and Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution. It also has a program for senior fellows who are working on books on aspect of Israel's life or Zionism or Jewish thought. And it also has a program for younger graduate scholars working in the same areas. His own first book was The Dawn, Political Thought in the Book of Esther. I think that the purposes of the Shalem institution probably suffice as an introduction of our speaker, Dr. Yoram Hazony. My great pleasure to introduce you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Burd, for the warm words of...
Can't hear you.
By the end, you'll be asking me to be quiet. I said I'd like to thank Dr. Burd for the warm words of welcome and for the gracious invitation. The book that I've written, which is actually, it's going to appear 2 weeks from now. It's being published jointly by the New Republic and Basic Books, is somewhat of an unusual effort in terms of books about Israel. I realized that for at least 30 years, maybe for the last 60 years, certainly for the last 30, Jews and non-Jews who are friends of Israel or interested in Israel, both abroad and in Israel itself, have focused overwhelmingly on the complexities of Israel's, let's say, its material survival, its physical survival, its wars and its periods between its wars and everything that's been connected to it. And on the one hand, I think that it's somewhat a sign of Israel's maturing that in the last elections, finally, I believe for the first time in Israeli history, there was an election in which over half of the Israeli public made its choice not on the basis of foreign policy issues, but on the basis of mundane matters like socialism versus capitalism, theocracy versus a libertarian state. I think there is something positive to the fact that Israel is finally having the opportunity now, for various reasons, to get to those issues. On the other hand, there is a pretty substantial downside to a country which has been as obsessed as Israel has been for so long with affairs that are military, and if you want to extend it to its most theoretical level, diplomatic as well, but mostly military. And that is that I think that maybe this will turn out to be true of other countries. It's certainly true of Israel, that for many, many years, the best resources of the country have been devoted to issues that are very far from questions of what should Israel's constitution be like, what should Israel's culture be like, what does it mean to have a Jewish state. For many, many years, these are questions that have been swept under the rug. And now that there is a certain sense that perhaps at least the hardest part of the battle for survival externally is over, you sort of pick up the rug under which things have been swept and find some things which are not so terribly pleasant. And that is going to be my topic for this evening, is one of the things which I believe is the most important thing that's been swept under the rug. I'm not coming here in order to offer simple solutions, but most of my comments are going to be descriptive. I'd like to try to persuade you. I understand that many of you are very knowledgeable in these kinds of areas. I'm going to attempt to persuade you that Israel has a particular problem, the problem of having lost an understanding of what it means to be a Jewish state, the state of the Jewish people, as it says in the Declaration of Independence. And I just want to tell you that at the outset that I believe it's a problem that can be solved, but I'm not coming here to give you simple solutions. Perhaps you can contribute. Now, there's been, over the last year, a certain degree of discussion of a phenomenon called post-Zionism, that's been called post-Zionism in the English-speaking world. In Israel, this is a topic that's been sort of very hot in the national media for at least 5 or 6 years. It finally spilled over into the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, various other prestigious foreign affairs, various other prestigious publications and media in North America, beginning last summer when the New York Times ran a front page story, some of you may have caught wind of it, reporting that Israel has produced new textbooks for some of its history curriculum in middle schools and is working on high schools, and that those books are in some ways reflective of a deep revision within the understanding of Israel's history, notably in the direction of suggesting that possibly Israel's cause, which is to say Zionism, the cause of establishing a Jewish state, may not have been quite as just as those of us who have supported it, been supporters of Zionism for many years, believed. Now, I don't want to belabor the specifics of of who is a Zionist and who is not a Zionist and who's a post-Zionist. I'm really quite unconcerned with the labels and the semantics. What I'm going to try to do is to get away from that. Anytime, I promise that if anyone challenges me on a label, I will retreat. I have no interest in it. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to describe a phenomenon which hopefully will appear coherent to you, and you can call it what you will. I just want to say, before I present some of the evidence, that the the people who call themselves post-Zionists or even anti-Zionists are not really sufficiently interesting, I think, to have written a book or to have brought you here this evening. That is to say that every country and every culture has its lunatic fringe, and I assume that it's more eloquent in some countries than in others. Israel has its lunatic fringe. But in general, to oversimplify, in general, all of the material that's appeared in print, certainly in the English language so far, on the subject of post-Zionism, of Israel moving away from Zionism, has identified as post-Zionists only that very, very small group of people who call themselves that, who say, I'm an anti-Zionist, meaning I oppose the idea of a Jewish state. Even though I live in the Jewish state and I served in its armed forces, I oppose the Jewish state because I think that, well, the arguments vary, but they tend to sound something like Zionism is racism. Okay? It's an unfair, it's an illegitimate concept to try to base a democracy on a particularistic nationality or religion or ethnic affiliation. I'm not going to speak about those people this evening unless someone has some specific question. What I'd like to talk about is Israel's mainstream culture, okay? Because my argument goes far beyond the claim that there are a few people in Israel who are very well known for arguing that the idea of a Jewish state is inherently illegitimate for a democracy. What I'd like to focus on is the people who are undisputably Israel's cultural mainstream. Okay, and those of you who are very familiar with Israeli culture, you can correct me if you think I'm making a mistake on some of this. My claim is that over all of these years that Israel has been focused on its tanks and its missile launchers, something has gone wrong with Israel's high culture and its public culture and ultimately its public mind. That is to say, that if you take a look at those people who are considered by Israelis to be the cultural leaders, and those people who then go on to influence government policy, because in Israel, perhaps more than in the United States, there is a very, very close relationship between what its intellectual leaders think and what happens within Israeli public policy, within the government bureaucracy. And my claim is that those people who almost invariably call themselves Zionists, okay, and again, I don't believe that it's my place to say that they're not. In many, many cases, they're people who have contributed much more to Israel's well-being and existence over their careers, certainly than I have and probably than I will. It's not my business to be challenging what they call themselves, but the claim that I would like to make is that cultural mainstream and many of its most prominent figures are people who themselves have, in the last 15 years, 10, 15, 20 years, moved to a position which is in various ways hostile, inimical to the ideas that are enshrined in Israel's Declaration of Independence, the ideas that most of us associate with David Ben-Gurion and the original labor Zionist founders and the broad Zionist consensus that they represented. I'd like to give you just a few examples. The first is from an essay by David Grossman. Okay, David Grossman is certainly understood to be a Zionist. He's also certainly understood to be somewhat radical politically, but not too radical. But I think that he's one of Israel's most eloquent spokesmen. And a few years ago, not that long after the signing of the Oslo Agreement, Grossman, who you probably, those of you who know his book, The Yellow Wind, may remember. He's other than Meir Shalev, he is Israel's most prominent young intellectual of the generation after Amos Oz. Anyway, he wrote an essay, really quite moving if you're willing to be moved in that direction, on the subject of the redeployment that Israelis are making. As you know, in the Oslo Accords, there's this phrase that Israel will have to execute a redeployment into a redeployment militarily within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But Grossman said that really this is not the essential issue. It's a crucial issue. It's a step that Israel has to take to reach peace. But the essential issue for Grossman was not the redeployment that Israel is involved in making on the ground, but rather what he called the redeployment in our souls that Israelis will now have to make if they really are going to achieve peace. Among other things, he said as follows: the Jews living in Israel are now being asked not only to give up on geographical territories, we must also implement a redeployment or even a complete withdrawal from entire regions in our souls. And then he gives a list of examples, such as the purity of arms. The purity of arms is one of these traditional Zionist concepts, which in a nutshell means we may have made mistakes, but our arms were always used in a just way in the service of a just cause. And he's saying we have to give up on that concept, on that idea, on that slogan, such as the purity of arms, such as being a precious people or a chosen people. Slowly, over long years, we will discover that we're beginning to give them up. Give up on power as a value, which is quite a radical concept for a country which was, in fact, brought into existence by Ben-Gurion and his fellows in order to give Jews enough power to be able to defend themselves. Giving up on power as a value, on the army itself as a value, on it's good to die for one's country, this famous slogan of Joseph Trumpeldor, his dying words at Tel Chai, or at least allegedly. On the best to the Air Force, Ezer Weizmann's call to the students at the universities, come join the Air Force, build the young country's Air Force, that's where you're needed. On Acharai, after me, which is the slogan of the Israeli infantry commander. In Israeli legend, it's only in the Jewish army, I don't know if it's true, that the officers are taught not to send the boys in ahead of them, but the officers are expected to run in first, leading the infantry. And these are all slogans that we have to give up on. We will discover how we are refining a new existence for ourselves, one which is no longer drenched to the point of suffocation with the myth of our exile from the land, or with the myth of Masada, or with a one-dimensional lesson of the Holocaust. Okay, in other words, all of the components that went into what Amos Oz once so aptly called the great drama, the great historical drama of, we once had a Jewish country and then the Romans defeated us and we were taken into exile and we suffered for thousands of years and we persevered nonetheless. And then finally Zionism brought us back. That entire sweep of the great drama has to be reevaluated in terms of, well, the historical fabrications, the moral fabrications that might be involved. Just to give you a couple of other examples of things that are part of this redeployment in our souls. A couple of years ago, Amos Oz, who is Israel's, I think without question, Israel's leading cultural spokesman and most highly regarded novelist, wrote an essay, and he is not seen, at least on cultural issues, certainly not seen as a radical. I mean, he is the Zionist mainstream, and in fact, somebody who I think that many of the post-Zionists attack as a reactionary. Nevertheless, a couple of years ago, Amos Oz wrote an essay about the Jewish state, the idea of the Jewish state, in which I think that he also staked out a position that 10 years ago or 15 years ago you would not have heard Amos Oz or anyone associated with him saying. Among other things, he said his argument was that a state can't legitimately be Jewish. There's no such thing as a Jewish state. It's just not a concept that can be applied in reality. He wrote, "A state cannot be Jewish, just as a chair or a bus cannot be Jewish. The state is no more than a tool that is efficient or a tool that is defective, a tool that is suitable or a tool that is unsuitable. And this tool must belong equally to all of its citizens, Jews, Muslims, Christians. The concept of a Jewish state is nothing other than a snare." And here he uses the word maduach. The word snare is the biblical word for a work of idolatry. Again, something I don't believe we would have heard until a few years ago. Similarly, Aleph Bet Yehoshua, who is second after Amos Oz, is Israel's most famous cultural leader among the cultural leadership, and also someone who I think almost everyone would say this is the Zionist mainstream, who within the last year gave what to me at least was a very shocking interview in which he repeatedly argued that the experiment has failed and that the experiment of having a Jewish people, which is also in some way linked to a Jewish religion, is simply, it doesn't work. And what we need to do is we need to create a country in which the Jews will simply stop being Jewish. They just won't be necessarily Jewish religiously. We just have to have a people that is just not Jewish. Here's one of, he repeats this over and over again. Here's one of the ways he phrases it. He says, "I realize this looks crazy, unrealistic now, but perhaps in another 100, 200 years, it will be possible. We have to turn this people into a people without a distinctive religion. Let the members of the Jewish people be Christians, Muslims. Religiously, there should be any number of different options so that our people can belong to various religions." And those of you who are familiar with Zionist history know that Zionism always had its traditionalists and its secularists and its radical secularists. But going all the way back to Herzl, the one thing that the Zionist movement always, the one place where the Zionist movement always drew a line was on the question of what's the relationship between Zionism and Judaism. Okay, all of the Zionist leaders, no matter how secular, okay, with the exception of Brenner, but let's say almost all of the mainstream Zionist leaders always said the Bible and Judaism are our heritage. Maybe we have to make changes in the way that this religion is practiced, or maybe not, but it's ours, it's our essence. And yet here we have the first time that I'm aware of in which a mainstream figure publicly dissociates himself entirely from the concept of Judaism as the heritage of the Jewish people. Again, I don't believe something that 10 years ago you could possibly have heard. Finally, I'd like to quote from a professor in Israel who is perhaps a little bit less familiar to all of you, but in Israel he is extremely well known. Eliezer Schweid, who is associated, if he's associated with if he leans any direction away from the center, he's associated with the center right and not with the center left, and is, I think, pretty much universally acclaimed for a generation already as being Israel's most important Zionist thinker. Okay, maybe Leibovitch is an exception, but he's known as the Zionist thinker. And yet, in an essay that he published last year, struggling to try to resolve the problem of the same problem that David Grossman and Amos Oz are talking about. We have an Arab population. How are we going to be fair to them? Is it possible to have a democratic country that's a Jewish state? And he came up with conclusions that are in some ways more radical than almost any of the others, the ones that virtually identical to what the so-called post-Zionists are saying. And he argues as follows, that we need to get away from the particularistic Zionism that focuses on Jews. We need to have a universal Zionism. And he writes, they keep on telling us, he writes, the only way to solve the problem of the tension between democracy and the Jewish state, the only way to solve the problem is to add to the Zionist flag, that's the Israeli flag, to add to the Zionist flag a symbol that will represent the participation of the Arab minority. Everywhere that I speak, I ask the audience, I promise, if you can tell me what this symbol is, unless it's a crescent moon or a cross. I mean, if you can tell me what the symbol is, then I promise that I'll repeat the suggestion to subsequent audiences. To add to the Zionist flag a symbol that will represent the participation of the Arab minority, and to compose an anthem that will express the Zionist purpose on a universal level. Loyalty to the land of Israel, to Jerusalem, and to the state of Israel, as symbols which express the hope of redemption, brotherhood, and peace for all who are called by the name Israel, and among all peoples. Such an anthem could unite all the citizens of the state, even though each one of them would use it to express his own national religious identity and the substance of his own special connection to the land of Israel, Jerusalem, and the state of Israel. And here, too, I think it's important to understand that for a state that was founded in order to be the state of the Jewish people, the one place in the world where Jews could be safe, I think you probably know that today is Holocaust Memorial Day. And I think that the founders of the State of Israel and the signers of the Declaration of Independence, by the way, the signers of the Declaration of Independence swept the entire spectrum from the communists to Agudat Israel, to the ultra-Orthodox. All of them signed the Declaration of Israel, which refers to Israel 5 times as a Jewish state. And I think that they all of them would have been shocked to know that today the Israeli flag is an embarrassment for Israel's intellectuals and has to be amended because it's too Jewish. Now, you will ask, completely reasonably, whether it isn't the case that these are just intellectuals. I mean, even if I'm right that this is representative of Israel's cultural mainstream rather than simply post-Zionist radicals, what does this have to do with reality? There's a lot to be said on the subject, and I don't want to belabor it. I'd like to give you just two examples of why I believe that this is, in fact, not merely a curiosity, but rather a threat to the state of Israel, to the Jewish state's existence, which I think is in many ways more substantial than any military threat that it faces. The first example is from 1994. Shortly after David Grossman wrote about the redeployment in our souls, the Israeli army adopted a code of ethics, which has now been in place for 6 years. According to this code of ethics, this code of ethics is used to teach every Israeli army officer. It's part of the training to become an Israeli army officer, and it's still in active use. This code of ethics was designed principally by a Tel Aviv University professor named Asa Kasher, who is also known as a Zionist and not as a post-Zionist. And in this code of ethics, which Professor Kasher says is the most advanced in the entire world, it's certainly an extremely complicated ethical contraption. In this code of ethics, Professor Kasher and his committee listed no fewer than 11 basic values that the Israeli army, that every Israeli soldier has to be taught, that the officers have to teach the troops, and according to which they have to conduct every mission that the State of Israel conducts. 11 basic values upon which he then used to deduce or to otherwise create 34 basic principles. That's 45 ethical units of value. And in this entire articulation of the values of the Israeli army, there is no mention at any point, either explicitly or implicitly, of Israel as a Jewish state, of the Jewish people, of the Jewish tradition, the land of Israel. Name something that is particularistically Jewish, it's not there. Now, this is something that I know a reasonable amount, not from my own personal not from my personal firsthand experience with it, but from two of my colleagues who serve in the IDF's unit, which teaches this course. They used to teach Land of Israel studies. In other words, in order to become an Israeli army officer, they'd hand you a Bible and take you out to the, to the historical sites and say, look, religious or not, this is what we're fighting about. And that course has now been replaced with this course, which teaches this universalist ethics. I don't have to tell you, I think, that that the distance between year after year of indoctrinating Israel's army officers, that what we're fighting for is Israeli democracy, and what we're defending is Israel's citizenry, and leaving out that we're fighting for the Jewish state, and that what we're defending is the Jewish people in addition to the citizens, that if that goes on long enough, I think that the consequences are likely to be pretty drastic. I mean, you can just imagine what happens when one of these smart, enlightened, argumentative Jewish youth is brought in to discuss the question of leading his unit, or her unit, into Ethiopia. The Israeli army conducted field operations in Ethiopia for over a decade in order to rescue foreign Jews. And the new code of ethics doesn't support it. The Israeli army, for many years, sent its officers into Russia in order to try to provide assistance and relief for Soviet Jews. Not many people know that. One of the officers one of the researchers, scholars at my institute, was himself a paratroop officer, and I know about it because he and his friends served in these missions. In other words, the Israeli army is being de-Judaized. It's having the Jewish purpose of it removed. Now that's pretty theoretical. I'd like to give you a second example, and with this I'll conclude my remarks and accept questions. Probably much more dramatic in a practical sense has been the overhaul in the education system in the last decade. Some of you may have seen an article that I published in the New Republic within the last month on this subject. This too, like the Code of Ethics, is a project of Israel's academia, and it involves the leaders, and again, the mainstream leaders, the people whose Zionism is not in question, of Israeli academia, particularly the Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University, those intellectual leaders, and we're talking about the leaders, we're talking about the heads of departments, we're not talking about some cranks, have for the last decade been working on an overhaul of the entire Israeli educational system in almost anything that has to do with anything Jewish. That means Jewish history, general history, civics, which should be the heart of teaching people to understand why we have a Jewish state, even archaeology, even literature. All of these disciplines, most of which are based on curriculums that were last altered in the early 1970s. All of these in the last decade have undergone a pretty dramatic reversal in what it is that they teach. There are many courses, there are many books that are coming out, and I can't bring you all of them, although it would be worth trying. So I've brought you one. Okay, this is a book which is called Olam Shel Tmuot, which means a world of changes. This is the new 9th grade history text. Just 2 words of background. For most of the years since Israel was founded, Israeli middle schoolers, which is to say kids from 6th grade to 9th grade throughout the country, learned a curriculum which was basically a Jewish history curriculum. You started with the Bible, not the Bible as religion, not the Bible as literature. In this course, the Bible is history. Okay, started with the Bible, and then spent the first 6 months, the first half of 6th grade, on dealing with the origins of the Jewish people. Okay, and then you go through this 4-year curriculum, which came up to the War of Independence or the 6-Day War, depending on which school you were in. But in other words, from King David up until David Ben-Gurion, you had the whole picture. Now, this curriculum spent a lot of time talking about other peoples, the Greeks and the Romans and the Germans and the Americans. There was quite a lot of material, but it was very clear, I think, to anyone who picks up these books now, that it's the sweep of Jewish history, of the history of the Jewish people, and the children are learning to see the contact with other peoples the way that the Jewish people saw them. The actor is the Jewish people. Now, in 1994, the chairman of the committee to revise the middle school history curriculum, Moshe Zimmerman, who is a professor at the Hebrew University, gave an interview to Haaretz, the leading prestige newspaper in Israel, in which, and this is just a little bit of personal, a sentence of personal history. This interview was really what got me interested in the subject, and in the end resulted in this book. Professor Zimmerman gave an interview to Haaretz in which he said, well, look, first of all, we've dropped the Bible. We spend too much time on ancient history, and so we're not going to teach the Bible anymore. Second, we've taken this principle that says that the story of the Jewish people can't be of primary importance, and that the emancipation of the Jews can't be taken to be any more important than the emancipation of the blacks in America, for example. Now, I don't think people took this fellow that seriously. Certainly there was no public reaction to this interview that I'm aware of. But in 1999, I mean really just a few months ago, we have this book which is the first product of this new curriculum as it applies to ninth grade. Okay? And this book gives you whatever you want to know. I mean, if you want to know, are these professors having an impact? Here it is. Okay, I realize that there's a limit to what you can see, but I think you can nevertheless get the point. This page, this is the beginning of the chapter on the founding of the State of Israel. Akamat Medinat Israel. Okay, the old textbooks devoted 60% of their material in ninth grade to the founding of the State of Israel, the history of Israel, Zionism, and the Holocaust. And in this book, it's under 30%. And you can see what the effect is. All right, this is the chapter of the founding of the State of Israel. Okay, and as you turn the pages, they go in Hebrew, they go the opposite direction. You can see from the diagrams. All right, the first thing that happens is there's a map of the of the UN partition plan from 1947, showing which countries voted for Israel and against, and that's of course fine and interesting. And then you turn the page, and you see a map with arrows on it. This is the map of the State of Israel, as it was in 1940, 48, 49. This is a traditional place to have a map. The old books also had this map. And they had arrows pointing inward, showing the invasion routes of all of the Arab armies the day after Israel declared independence in May 1948. Anyone who can see this can see that here the arrows are in the reverse direction. This multicolor map is a map showing the exodus of Palestinian Arabs from the territory of the State of Israel. Okay, there is no, I mean the old map, it just isn't here. There is no map showing the invasion route of the Arab armies. There's no picture of David Ben-Gurion declaring independence, and there's no pictures of Jewish soldiers. I mean, it wasn't just Israelis, it was volunteers from all over the world, of Jewish soldiers in the trenches fighting and dying for the establishment of the state. It's all gone. Okay, the text is quite as appalling, but I think you can see it better with the diagrams. This picture, which is the first photograph that we come across, is in fact the only photograph in the chapter on the establishment of the State of Israel. This picture is a picture of Palestinian Arab refugees in a refugee camp in Jordan. Okay, I forgot to mention one important point. This is the official education ministry textbook. Okay, this is not one of the private ones. This is the one that the education ministry created, and in some sense is the trendsetter. There's another map here of the State of Israel. This is something that I've also never seen in a history book before. This is a map of the Jewish expansion during the War of Independence. As most people are not so sharply aware of this, that the Israeli War of Independence was fought in 3 different stages. And one of the arguments that post-Zionists have been making for quite some time is that if the war was defensible at all, if they're really extreme, they say that the War of Independence simply wasn't defensible to begin with. But those who say that it was defensible to begin with, they make a very clear distinction. They say the first 4 weeks of fighting, that was defensible because the Arab armies were invading. But after that, everything that happened after that was not defensible because it was aggression. Okay, so that's most of the War of Independence is being retold as a story of aggression. This book doesn't say that explicitly. The map says it quite beautifully. That is, you can, here you are, you're in 9th grade, you can, if you like maps, you can see, for example, that the entire Negev and half of the Galilee were added in later stages, and you can see the expansion. Let's turn to, this is the chapter on the, it's called Shnotei Rishonot Shel Chevra Yisraelit. This is the first years of Israeli society. And before this book came out, I had wondered for many years, seriously, whether there exist any photographs of Jews building a Jewish village or a Jewish town or settlement on the ruins of an Arab village. And now I know the answer, because it's here. The first photograph in this chapter describing the first 10 years of the state, and again, the text is this is indicative of what's in the text as well, is captioned. The construction work in the Arab village, the abandoned Arab village of Ein Hud, that turned into the Jewish village of Ein Hod, 1949. Okay, on the next page, you have Jewish immigrants coming in. And then you jump to the Six-Day War. This is part of the fact that this is such a universal history, and only 30% of it is devoted to things Zionist and Jewish. Things Zionist and Israeli. The result of this is that you hop to the Six-Day War, and this too is an amazing document. The Six-Day War is not described as though it were a just war that was perhaps a mistake, perhaps not, provoked at least by Arab threats. There is no mention of the blockading of the Straits of Tiran, of the blockade on the city of Eilat. There is no mention of the Syrian attempts to divert the headwaters of the Jordan. There's no mention of the threats to throw the Jews into the sea. All of that, of course, appears in the old textbooks. The new textbooks don't have anything. They say that the Six-Day War was precipitated by Israel shooting down Syrian MiGs in a month before the war. That's where the story begins. Israel shoots down the MiGs, and then the Egyptians, as a reaction, put their forces into the Sinai. And here's another beautiful picture. You'll notice that we're 1967 now. There's still no picture of David Ben-Gurion. Okay, there aren't any in the book. This photograph is the one photograph that you have that represents the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War in the old textbooks had the following kind of photograph. The old city of Jerusalem, pictures of the old stones, the Western Wall, that kind of thing. Most importantly, there was an entire page filled with a photograph, a very famous photograph, of Moshe Dayan and Yitzhak Rabin with their helmets still on, walking through the Lion's Gate into the old city on their way to the Western Wall, which is, in a shot, represents everything that the text says. Okay? It is the heroic Jews with the eye patch, but still alive nonetheless, walking into the old city to return to their capital. And this photograph, which I think is really in some ways a work of genius, this photograph has an Israeli half-track marooned in the middle of Kalandia Airport in East Jerusalem under this big sign in Arabic, okay, which means it's not the Jews entering the old city. That's too Jewish. This is the Jews sitting in the middle of what's clearly an Arab airport. And that's it. Okay, that's it for the story of the Six-Day War. All right, I promised that I would be brief, and I've already broken my promise. I thank you for listening patiently. I'll take questions.
thanks very much. I think that's a very clear picture of the circumstance. The floor is now open for questions. The question, to state it simply, is there a demand of justice to treat the Arab minority population as if they were full citizens of the State of Israel?
Well, of course there is. I mean, I don't know too many people who deal with ideas in Israel who don't think that the clauses in Israel's Declaration of Independence, which were also signed by, by this remarkable spectrum of Jewish political parties, which speak about the civil and political equality of Israel's minorities. I don't know anybody serious who doesn't embrace those principles. There's obviously a tremendous policy argument, get into details about what does it, what does that mean? In some cases, you're absolutely right. There are, to take a case that I think is very clear-cut, and to me at least not ambiguous at all, Israel's Druze population, which is a population which is allied fully with the Jewish population, in that since the late 1950s, the great majority of the Druze have served in the Israeli army and have contributed and are flesh and parcel of the Jewish state. I think that those areas where a population such as the Druze makes the argument that we are not being sufficiently, we're not being treated justly. I think that is it's something that cries out for redress, and I think that if someone came to me and said, "Look, the Druze are not Jews. We think that more time should be devoted in the textbooks to telling their story," then I would say that we would have to be either callous or fools. I simply agree with you. I think that where you get into other parts of the population, it's a policy debate. There's a question: who is disenfranchising whom? Do the Arabs actually want? I mean, the non-Druze and non-Circassians. I'm talking about the Arab Muslim majority. Are they willing to serve in the army? I don't think that that's been. I don't think that that's been fully tested yet, and until there is an Arab leadership within Israel that is that's willing to discuss these topics based on the premise that, for example, the Israeli flag should remain as it is. In other words, that they're willing to say, redress for various of our grievances, but we're willing to accept the fact that this is unlike other countries, this is a Jewish state founded with the purpose of defending its citizens, but especially of defending Jews around the world. If they're willing to accept that and to say that, then I think we have something to talk about. Unfortunately, my understanding of the internal politics of the Arab community, and here it's very possible that the leadership doesn't represent the Arab population, but the leadership of the Arab community is extraordinarily radical, and it has fully identified itself with the post-Zionist or anti-Zionist camp. That is to say, the argument that Israel should in no ways be a Jewish state is the position of the Arab parties in the Knesset, and I think we're limited in what it is that we're capable of doing so long as that's the situation.
What is the relationship between the struggle between secular Jews and theologically oriented Jews on the other hand, that struggle, with the problem which you present of the dilution of the integrity of the Jewish state?
Well, I don't know if in terms of ideas, I mean in terms of political philosophy or theory, I don't know if there is any inherent connection. Politically, sociologically, obviously you're right, there is a tremendous connection between what today in Israel is called the secular versus Orthodox divide and the the issue of Zionism or post-Zionism. The connection is pretty simple. The center, which was occupied historically by people, beginning with Herzl and Ahad Ha'am at the beginning of Zionism and continuing through David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin in the decades immediately after the state. That consensus of the center, which saw Judaism as being a pluralism of cultures, or if not a pluralism of cultures, at least a religion or a culture that was modernizing and could adjust itself to modernity. That center, in terms of ideas, has basically collapsed, so that what we're seeing today is two intellectual elites, if you will. One trained in the universities, who find it extremely difficult to justify a Jewish state, believing increasingly that it is, in some sense, in a crucial sense, a violation of the idea of equality and democracy. On the other hand, you have the people who are graduating from the yeshivas. Obviously, I'm speaking in tremendous sweeping generalizations, and there are exceptions on all sides. But in general, you have this other competing intellectual elite, which is trained in the yeshivas and in the Orthodox religious academies, for whom it's just as clear that democracy is a problem. Okay, now, both of these two elites are in a sense correct, because who they're talking about is one another. That is, you've got the extreme cultural left saying to the people in the middle, look at those theocrats, they want to take away, they want to force their kind of Judaism down your throat. Whereas the rabbis associated with that camp say to their constituents, which is a rapidly growing constituency because of this dispute, look over there at the other side, they want your kids to, they don't want your kids to be Jews. They don't want your kids to learn Bible in the schools. I mean, this is what the actual election campaign is based on. If you ask, how is it possible that what's a relatively small Orthodox community in Israel could be skyrocketing in terms of its representation in the Knesset, it's this debate that's doing it, because each side is using the other as a caricature in order to gain itself votes and support, and with great success.
Is there a correlation between the social and spiritual changes you refer to and economic prosperity?
Many people who have been trying to understand what's happening in Israel culturally have referred to the fact, have made a connection between the increasing individualism and capitalism of the culture. And I don't think there's any question. There obviously is some correlation. There's also other factors which you can correlate. For example, the increasing influence of things American in Israel. The fact that the United States is a different kind of democracy applies a certain kind of pressure. Now there's also a pressure from Europe, which I think is in many ways much less benign, in that many of the Europeans are much more hostile to the idea of Israel as a Jewish state, and as Israelis are increasingly exposed to it, they run into a problem. In addition, you can point to, and people have, the relationship between what's happening among intellectuals in Israel and intellectual fads in Europe and the United States. Postmodernism is something that is directly linked to post-Zionism by many of the people who are most excited about promoting it. All of these are correlates, and all of them are contributing factors. I think the important question, though, is whether this was inevitable. And in that regard, I think that it wasn't, meaning that what I tried to show in the historical section of my book, I devote about a third of the book to to contemporary issues of the kind that we've been discussing this evening. The other two-thirds of the book is a historical survey, an attempt to reconstruct what was the original idea of the Jewish state as advanced by Herzl and the Zionist organization, and what happened to it. How did we get here? And to actually try to see causation, like within the changes, what was causing them. And in my opinion, the most important factor is the fact that almost incongruously, the university system in Israel and many of the other institutions of higher education, such as the Bezalel Arts Academy and various other of the cultural leaders, the institutions and individuals who were cultural leaders, were dominated by individuals, meaning by Jews who opposed the idea of a Jewish state. It's something that is extremely, how do I put it? It's almost untouched within treatments of Israeli history, because up until not that many years ago, the view of, you take any of the histories of Zionism in Israel that you're familiar with in English, whether it's Howard Sachar's 1,000-page book or Connor Cruz O'Brien's excellent book, which is 800 pages, and there's a few others. All of these books, if you look up the names of the leading intellectuals in Palestine, people like Martin Buber, Hugo Bergman, Yuda Magnus, Richard Kovner, the founder of history in the study of history in Israel. There's a list of something like, 2 or 3 dozen people who are in this group, which is intellectuals who, as early as 1916, and certainly by the time that the Hebrew University was founded in 1925, they already opposed the idea of a Jewish state for exactly the grounds that we've been talking about today, because a Jewish state will be unjust and a harnessing of Jewish power, which is inherently corrupt, to Jewish peoplehood and religion, which could theoretically be pure. I try to demonstrate that lineage, that the fact that the cultural institutions were founded and operated for decades by people who were explicitly opposed to, and in some cases fought diplomatically to prevent the establishment of the State of Israel, that has had a dramatic effect on what it is that people study to this day within Israeli universities and the way that they see the world. And of course, by the time you add these other factors that you're bringing in, it just completes the picture. But I think that if it had not been for that original opposition between Palestinian Jewish intellectuals, their opposition to a Jewish state, I don't think that individualism or capitalism would have trounced Zionism in the way that we're seeing today.
Let me, on behalf of the audience, thank you for what I think was a very, very interesting evening.